Hello, welcome to my channel. Welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann, and today I want to talk briefly about a book I read in the month of October. This is Square Haunting, 5 Writers in London Between the Wars by Francesca Wade. I read this for a book club. It was for Margaret Pennard's Patreon book club, so I will link to her channel or maybe to the Patreon. I'll put links down below if anybody wants to do it. It's a bi-monthly book club, so every other month. We gather on Zoom and read a book. So this is nonfiction, and this book I think has such a cool premise. So it's centered on 5 women writers who lived in Mecklenburg Square in London, roughly between the period of the 2 world wars. So we're starting a bit before World War I, and then the final one is Virginia Woolf, who was renting or owned a house in Mecklenburg Square up until the time of her death, just about in 1940. So a pretty big time period, but these 5 writers, these are pictures of them on the front of the book. They either knew each other or had all of the same acquaintances as sort of part of the Bloomsbury, because Mecklenburg Square is sort of within that Bloomsbury area. Within that Bloomsbury literary set, that's sort of famous in literature of the time period. And the premise of this book is that all of these women were sort of breaking the Victorian mold for what a woman should do and how she should live her life at that period. And of course, the sort of the Victorian way of life was breaking down all across British society. With the advent of World War I and all of the sort of social, cultural, political changes that were taking place. But these 5 women were really sort of trailblazers in their intense desire and deliberate decisions that they made in their lives to really carve out an independent space as women, sort of earning their own income and becoming luminaries in their fields. So the 5 women, I should say who they are. So Hilda Doolittle, who wrote under her initials HD. I think, yeah, she's this one. And now I'm going to see if I can get this all right. I think this is Virginia Woolf, who needs no introduction. I think here we have Eileen Power, who was an economic historian. Dorothy L. Sayers, of course, detective fiction writer. And then Jane Harrison, who was also an academic, like Eileen Power, and she did a lot of sort of retranslation and of the classics. And oh gosh, where am I going? Oh yeah, and sort of uncovering history and religion before the ancient Greeks. So yeah, so 5 incredible women writers, and I was just gonna read a couple sentences from Francesca Wade, from the author, about that I thought were just a pretty good summary of the book. So all these women's lives contain periods of ambivalence, sometimes of deep unhappiness. Nonetheless, in learning about each of them, I have been moved by their determination to carve out new molds for living. Varied, multiple, complex, sometimes dangerous, yet always founded on a commitment to personal integrity and a deep desire for knowledge. So all of these women were just utterly convinced, and they were right, that they had the same capabilities as men to succeed in all of their chosen fields, whether it was fiction or academic work. And so this book talks about how Mecklenburg Square, in particular, as sort of a bohemian place in London, was integral to the development of all of these women into sort of more independent women. And Mecklenburg Square at the time was a little bit unique in that it had sort of transformed into a whole lot of boarding houses where you could find cheap lodging, and you could find lodging in a boarding house where the rooms and apartments were shared by other artists and writers and young women. And so it was sort of like a safe and affordable place where if you were, a young woman trying to make your own way, pay all of your own bills, be totally independent in London, you actually sort of had a chance. And these boarding houses were usually run by somebody who was cooking meals. And so one thread that's woven through all of this comes from Virginia Woolf, who we know the most about of any of these women, is A Room of One's Own that she wrote. And the idea there that women can achieve just as much or maybe more in a lot of cases if they have dedicated space to write, space that is not also part of the family space or part of the public life of the family, and if they're not responsible for household duties. And so all of these women were, to various degrees, able to accomplish a room of their own in Mecklenburg Square. And so that's sort of the thread that ties them all together. So they often all sort of came to Mecklenburg Square deliberately looking for that, found it, and used that period of their life to sort of catapult the next part of their career. So I found this book really, really compelling and convincing. I think, that initial premise, it sounds a little funny. It's like, well, who cares if they all lived in the same general area? Like, what bearing could that possibly have? But it just seems like it's so important in that cultural change from the Victorian ideal of like the woman's place was just in the home. And they even talk about, Francesca Wade talks about early in the book, how the setup of the houses even reflected that. Like in a typical Victorian middle class or upper class home, the man of the family would have his own private study, that was usually like sacrosanct. The woman had no private space in the house. And, there was always like the parlor or the drawing room or whatever, that was supposed to be sort of her domain, the female domain, except that that was the public space of the home as well. So that was where visitors would be brought into when they came to the home. And so women never had sort of like this safe, quiet place where they could just concentrate without interruption. They were always, and some of the I almost say characters, some of the writers in this book, they actually talk about that like in their letters. So we have direct quotes where they're like, well, I'm free from sort of that stress, or like free from that constant interruption. So that sort of weaves, that idea as it's stated in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, weaves through all 5 of these sort of mini biographies, because that's the piece that the author, Francesca Wade, sort of identifies in Mecklenburg Square, is that for most of these women, for the first time, they really were able to have a room of their own. And some of them were unhappy there, and some of them were happy there. But in all their cases, that experience, really seems to have sort of shifted something in their lives and in their writing and thinking, which I just thought was so cool. So I mentioned sort of 5 mini biographies. So there are 5 writers in here. And it really is sort of like 5 mini biographies, with the center point of each one being the time that the writer spent in Mecklenburg Square. So we get some description of what happened in their lives beforehand, with an emphasis on how it wasn't working. So on how whatever their life was set up like before, how it might have felt stifling, how it might have felt frustrating, how they felt like they couldn't sort of like break out from sort of struggling along and become sort of the greatness that they all eventually became. And then we get the Mecklenburg Square period, where we get a description of like what they were working on in Mecklenburg Square and how they sort of described that time in their lives, in their own writing and in their letters, and how sort of like themes and even direct events from their lives in the Mecklenburg Square time are reflected in their later works. And then we do get some discussion of what happened after each of these women left Mecklenburg Square, and sort of what happened in their career, and how the themes that they started in Mecklenburg Square seem to have continued throughout their work. So again, I found it very compelling. So if you're the sort of person that, like me, can sometimes get bored with an entire biography about someone, this book is only about 320 pages and is covering like sort of like brief biographies of these 5 incredible women. And I just think that whole idea is just really interesting, of like sort of what happened, to create these modernist female writers, especially like Dorothy L. Sayers and Virginia Woolf, who I'd heard about. But then even these other women who I hadn't heard about, and there are so many more that sort of appear in the pages of this book briefly that I hadn't heard about. So I'm just really curious sort of about that cultural shift that gave us this whole new generation of really powerful female writers that I now want to read a lot more about. But anyway, yeah, so this was sort of my jam. It was biography in the context of a cultural, historical, economic shift. So I really highly recommend it. I think, as far as I can tell, I mean, the research seems impeccable, and I thought the writing was really well done. So highly recommend. Yeah, with that, I'll sign off. So thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.